Hello, Indian Creek 8th grade students. This is Mr. Roush, bringing you the second unit in Social Studies, Reconstruction. This is part 1 of a 4-part video series, and this is Reconstruction Plans. The guiding question we're going to have is, what were the different plans for Reconstruction, and how were they different from each other? Efforts made in the United States between 1865 and 1877 to restructure the political, legal, and economic system in the states that had seceded from the Union is known as Reconstruction. The Americans faced many difficult questions after the war. 3 of the main questions were, should the slaveholding Southerners be punished or forgiven? What rights should be granted to the freed African Americans? And how could the war-torn nation be brought back together? These are some of the questions that we discussed yesterday in our small groups in social studies, since the South had enormous problems. So a lot of their towns and cities were ruined. Plantations were burned, roads, bridges, and railroads were destroyed, and over 250,000 Confederate soldiers died, as well as thousands more faced illness or had wounds from the war. They also faced the task of rebuilding with few resources and without the help of a lot of the adult males that passed away in the war or were injured from the war. So we're going to focus on the 3 main plans for Reconstruction. Reconstruction is a period of rebuilding, and it also refers to the various plans for accomplishing the rebuilding. The first plan that we're going to talk about is Abraham Lincoln's 10% plan. Lincoln's 10% plan is where 10% of the voters had to pledge loyalty to the Union. Lincoln felt that secession was constitutionally impossible, and the Confederate States of America had never technically left the Union. He announced his plan in December of 1863. In his plan, the state would form a new state government and create a new state constitution that had to ban slavery. Lincoln also encouraged Southerners who supported the Union to take control of the government. Abraham Lincoln believed that punishing the South would only delay the healing of the nation. And as we learned in the first chapter, Lincoln's main goal was preserving the Union, so he didn't want to punish the South in fear that they would just break away from the Union. Another part of Lincoln's plan was he was going to grant amnesty to all white Southerners except Confederate generals. So amnesty is basically a pardon. So they just let them go and didn't punish them at all. And also, African Americans could only vote if they were educated and served in the Union Army. The first 3 states to establish governments under the 10% plan were Louisiana, Arkansas, and Tennessee. But there was a big problem with that. These states became caught in a struggle between the President and Congress when Congress refused to seat the states' representatives. They thought that President Lincoln's plan was too weak, and they wanted a different plan. And their different plan was known as the Radical Republicans. They were led by Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner. They believed that Lincoln's plan was too mild and Congress should be in control of Reconstruction. Here's a picture of Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner. So Thaddeus Stevens declared that Southern institutions must be broken up and relaid, or all our blood and treasure have been spent in vain. Controlled by the Radical Republicans, Congress voted to deny seats to representatives from any state restructured under Lincoln's plan. Then Congress began to create its own plan. The plan that the Radical Republicans had, they believed in abolishing slavery and total equality of the races. They wanted to prosecute those involved in the Confederacy, and they wanted faster destruction of slavery. They also wanted the freed slaves to be granted full citizenship and given the right to vote. In July 1864, Congress passed the Wade-Davis bill. The bill offered a plan much harsher than Lincoln's plan. First, a majority, or at least 50% of the white males in the state had to swear loyalty to the Union. Also, former Confederate soldiers could not hold office. They also had to adopt a new constitution that abolishes slavery, and the Constitution could only be voted on by white males who swore they would never hold arms against the Union. If all of these were met, only then could a state be readmitted into the Union. The radical Republicans thought they had a great thing with the Wade-Davis bill, but Lincoln vetoed the bill, which outraged the radical Republicans. The radical Republicans thought that Congress should have supreme authority over the Reconstruction, kind of like how we debated in class who should have control, whether it's the president, the South, or Congress. The radical Republicans are the ones that thought that Congress should have supreme authority over Reconstruction. So Lincoln wanted to encourage the formation of new state governments so that order could be restored quickly, but Lincoln realized that he would have to compromise with the radical Republicans. There was also more progress being made on the other great issue of Reconstruction, which was helping African Americans freed from slavery. In March of 1865, during the final weeks of the war, Congress and the President established a new government agency to help former enslaved persons, or freedmen, called the Freedmen's Bureau. This agency was actually part of the Army. It helped transition the slaves to freed life. It also assisted the Southerners who supported the Union. So in the years following the war, the Freedmen's Bureau played an important role in helping African Americans make the transition to freedom. The Freedmen's Bureau achieved one of its greatest successes in the area of education. The Bureau established schools, staffed mostly by teachers from the North. It also gave aid to new African American institutions of higher learning, such as Atlanta University, Howard University, and Fisk University. The Freedmen's Bureau also helped freed people acquire land that had been abandoned by owners or seized by Union armies. It offered African Americans free transportation to the countryside where laborers were needed, and it helped them obtain fair wages. Although its main goal was to aid African Americans, the Bureau also helped Southerners who had supported the Union. Reconstruction seemed to be taking steps in the right direction, and then a tragic event happened April 14, 1865, when the President and Mrs. Lincoln were attending the play Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Lincoln was assassinated. He was shot at Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth. Booth was an accomplished Shakespearean actor and a racist from Maryland. Originally, there were 4 targets. They were going after President Lincoln, who was shot and killed, Ulysses S. Grant, who was not at the play, William Seward, who was seriously injured, he was actually stabbed at the play, and Vice President Andrew Johnson, who never made it to the play, and he was supposed to go with Lincoln. So Lincoln was never really supposed to be shot and killed. In 1864, Booth and some others planned to capture Lincoln at a hospital visit and take him to Richmond. He was going to be held ransom for Confederate prisoners of war. This never happened, and Lincoln's schedule changed at the last minute. 2 weeks after Appomattox, Lincoln gave a speech about African Americans getting voting rights. John Wilkes Booth is in the crowd and gets so upset that he vows to kill Lincoln. And he followed through and killed Lincoln. And Lincoln's death shocked the nation. Many Southerners were upset because they wanted Lincoln's plan to work. Out of all the plans, Lincoln's plan was pretty lenient and pretty weak compared to the radical Republicans' plan. So that's why many of the Southerners wanted that to go follow through. Many African Americans mourned his death, and many Northerners grieved for their leader who saved the Union. They actually had a funeral train route which started in Washington, D.C., and went all the way around this way, up to Albany, New York, Buffalo, Cleveland, Columbus, Indianapolis, Michigan City, Chicago, and all the way back down to Springfield. This was a big deal because back then, 1 in 4 people actually came out to the train route to see Abraham Lincoln before he was laid to rest. When Lincoln died, Vice President Andrew Johnson became president. He was formerly a Democratic senator from Tennessee and had been the only senator to support the Union during the Civil War. He revealed his plan for Reconstruction. He resented the slaveholders that had dominated the South and wished to punish them. As a result, radicals thought Johnson would create a harsh plan they would accept. Johnson, however, believed in giving the states control over many decisions, and he had no desire to help the African Americans. Johnson's plan was called Presidential Reconstruction, where each state must withdraw secession. Southerners were granted amnesty once they swore an oath of loyalty to the Union, and Confederate officials and wealthy landowners could be pardoned, but only by personally applying to the president. Johnson also appointed governors to Southern states and required them to hold elections for state constitutional conventions. Only whites who had sworn their loyalty and had been pardoned would be allowed to vote. Johnson opposed granting freed African Americans equal rights or letting them vote. He believed that each Southern state should decide what to do about freed people, saying, "White men alone must manage the South." But before a state could re-enter the Union, its constitutional convention had to denounce secession and abolish slavery. States also had to ratify the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which Congress had passed in January of 1865. This amendment abolished slavery in all parts of the United States. By the end of 1865, all of the former Confederate states had formed new governments and were ready to rejoin the Union. President Johnson declared that restoration was almost complete. So to wrap it up, we had Lincoln's 10% plan, the Radical Republicans' plan led by Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, and Johnson's presidential restoration. That's all I have for today. Tune in next time for part 2 of the 4-part video series on restoration. Thanks for watching and have a great day.